Donald Trump loves the aesthetics of power more than the substance of it. He treats geopolitics like reality TV. Announce something dramatic, demand everyone react as if it's decisive, then declare victory no matter what happens next. The problem is that the real world doesn't edit itself to fit his storyline. Ships still sail, markets still move, allies still watch, adversaries still test boundaries. And when the stunt collapses, as it so often does with Trump, what's left is a weaker United States, a more chaotic region, and a leader who confuses bluster with strategy. That pattern is exactly what we're watching in the latest Trump-Iran saga. Loud threats, performative toughness, and then an immediate retreat into talks once the show of force proves hollow. A supposed blockade in a choke point as sensitive as the Strait of Hormuz is not a meme, not a press release, not a social media posture. It's a potentially explosive act that can trigger confrontation, disrupt energy flows, and raise global tensions in a matter of hours. If you're going to signal that kind of escalation, you'd better have a plan that goes beyond vibes. But Trump never does. He announces maximalist moves, then acts shocked when the world doesn't snap into place around his ego. When enforcement looks porous, when tankers keep moving, when the blockade turns into selective inconvenience rather than real leverage, Trump's strongman pose flips into its opposite. Frantic damage control. He doesn't hold a line. He hunts for an exit ramp. Suddenly there are talks. Suddenly there are negotiations. Suddenly the same administration that was allegedly going to make Iran surrender is bargaining over timelines and venues and concessions. This is not strength. This is the strategic equivalent of pounding your chest and then asking the room if anyone wants to discuss a compromise after you've shown you can't back up your threat. And it's worse than incoherence. It's predictable incoherence, because Trump's foreign policy is not organized around national interest, deterrence, alliance management, or long-term stability. It's organized around optics and short-term political needs, especially the need to juice attention, manipulate headlines, and play games with markets. When your guiding principle is personal benefit, your decisions become erratic by design. One day, it's a theatrical escalation. The next, it's a rushed negotiation framed as genius deal-making. Meanwhile, the costs land on everyone else. Service members deployed into volatile postures, diplomats forced to mop up confusion, allies forced to guess whether America's commitments are real, and adversaries invited to probe for weakness because weakness is exactly what the performance reveals. This is the cruel joke of MAGA strength. It's not strength, it's volatility. And volatility is not a deterrent when your opponent realizes you don't have a coherent endgame. Real deterrence depends on credibility on your adversary, believing that your threats are not just loud, but executable, sustainable, and tied to clear objectives. Trump burns that credibility like gasoline. He wants the intimidation without the discipline. He wants the submission without the structure. He wants the respect without the hard work of coalition building, lawful statecraft, and consistent messaging. So he gets the opposite: mockery abroad, confusion at home, and a negotiation posture that starts from self-inflicted weakness. The most telling part is how quickly the conversation seems to slide away from sweeping demands toward narrower, more concessionary outcomes. Trump and MAGA world spent years screaming that Obama's Iran nuclear deal was weak, that it empowered Tehran, that it should be torn up rather than enforced and improved. Then Trump tore it up. And what followed wasn't some triumphant new era of American leverage. It was Iran resuming nuclear activities, regional tensions rising, and the U.S. repeatedly lurching between provocation and negotiation with less international unity than before. That's the legacy of performative sabotage. You break something imperfect that was at least containing a problem, and you replace it with chaos that makes containment harder. Now, with Trump posturing again, the outcome looks like the same downward spiral, except this time, the tough guy posture sets up the bargaining table in a way that rewards Iran for simply waiting out the tantrum. If the U.S. signals a maximalist threat and then cannot enforce it, the other side learns that endurance is the winning play. They don't have to blink. They just have to watch Trump cycle through rage, confusion, and retreat. And once that dynamic sets in, any deal that emerges risks being worse precisely because Trump has already demonstrated he needs something, anything, to claim as a win. That's where the comparison to Obama-era diplomacy becomes so revealing and so damning to MAGA mythology. The Obama approach, whatever you think of it, was built around painstaking coalition alignment, verifiable constraints, and a framework that could be evaluated with evidence rather than vibes. Trump's approach is the inverse. He trashes institutions, insults allies, undermines verification regimes, and then expects the world to treat his improvisations as master strategy. He wants credit for pressure while simultaneously eroding the very alliances and enforcement mechanisms that make pressure meaningful. When MAGA influencers insist that the regime will collapse if we just keep the pressure on, they're selling a fantasy that depends on the U.S. being disciplined, unified, and credible, three traits Trump actively corrodes. And because Trump is Trump, the mess doesn't stay confined to Iran. It bleeds into everything. Allies second-guessing America's reliability, adversaries recalculating how far they can push, and domestic propaganda outlets trying to spin disruption as success. We see this in the way right-wing media reflexively reframes bad news into a victory lap. Inflation metrics rise, and suddenly the messaging becomes lower than expected, as if redefining the baseline is governance. International humiliation happens, and suddenly it's strategic, or part of the deal, or the art of negotiation, as if improvisation is genius. The narrative machine exists to protect Trump from accountability, not to help Americans understand what's happening. Meanwhile, the human costs accumulate off camera. When leadership is chaotic, it's not Trump who pays the price, it's the troops deployed into tense regions under muddled orders. It's the families paying higher prices when energy markets jitter. It's the diplomats and intelligence analysts trying to interpret contradictory signals. It's allies forced to consider hedging their bets because U.S. commitments are tied to one man's impulsive mood swings. And it's Americans watching their government whipsaw between theatrics and retreat, while the same administration chooses culture war distractions over real problem solving. This is also why Trump's obsession with spectacle at home is not separate from his failures abroad. It's the same disease. The constant pivot to scapegoats and distractions is not random. It's a political survival tactic. When the results are bad, when the blockade posture turns into a punchline, when negotiations look like a climb down, when inflation flares, when governance collapses into corruption and cover-ups, the easiest move is to flood the zone with moral panic. Pick a vulnerable minority, stoke resentment, shout about bathrooms, blame immigrants, create a sense of siege so supporters feel they're defending their guy rather than evaluating his performance. And what does that do? It hollows out democratic accountability. It turns politics into identity warfare, where admitting failure feels like betrayal. It trains people to interpret every criticism as an attack by enemies rather than as a demand for competence. That's how you get a movement that can watch a leader promise dominance, deliver disorder, and still cheer, because the cheering itself becomes the point. MAGA becomes less a political program and more a loyalty test, one that rewards the loudest denial of reality. Look at the broader strategic picture. A United States led by someone who treats global security as content is a United States that invites instability. Authoritarian regimes don't have to fear Trump when they can read him like a script. They learn that he escalates for attention and de-escalates when enforcement requires sustained competence. They learn that he prioritizes personal optics over institutional capacity. They learn that he's more interested in punishing allies who won't flatter him than in building coalitions to constrain adversaries. And they learn that his domestic media ecosystem will applaud almost anything so long as it's framed as dominance. That's not deterrence. That's a green light for adversaries to wait him out, game his ego, and exploit the cracks in alliance cohesion. The real tragedy is that Americans are left with the bill. Strategic setbacks, elevated risks, and the corrosion of trust in institutions that actually matter. We don't get peace through strength. We get danger through vanity. If Democrats and, honestly, any responsible Americans want to counter this, we have to tell the truth about what we're seeing. Trump's foreign policy is not a coherent doctrine. It's a cycle of threat, failure, spin, and retreat, wrapped in propaganda that demands applause while the country absorbs the consequences. The choice isn't between weak diplomacy and strong threats. The choice is between evidence-based statecraft and performative chaos, between building coalitions that constrain adversaries and burning relationships to feed a cult of personality, between governance and grift. Trump promised domination. What he delivers is a headline, a stunt, and then a scramble to negotiate from a worse position than before, while his media allies insist we didn't see what we just saw. And if we keep letting that pattern pass as strength, we're not just enabling a failed leader. We're training the world to doubt America's seriousness and training ourselves to mistake noise for power